Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link in association with Celonis. Today we're looking at the Vodafone P2P digital transformation journey. My name is Susie West. I'm the founder and CEO at Shared Services Link. Very pleased to be presenting as my guest speaker today, Anthony Dayton. He's the Chief Marketing Officer at Celonis, and he is going to be sharing with us the detail of the Vodafone story. So let's have a look at context for this webinar today. In the world of shared services, we are dealing with purchase to pay, we're dealing with other end-to-end processes as well, but this has more of a P2P bent today. And when we're dealing with the world of purchase to pay, we are dealing with a process flow. And we're dealing with, most of us, hundreds of thousands of transactions that are coming from tens of thousands of suppliers and probably have associated with them potentially thousands, maybe tens of thousands of buyers or people that have touch points with that transaction within the organization. So any purchase to pay process is going to be potentially burdened with sometimes up to kind of 26, 27 touch points within an organization. And if you've got hundreds of thousands of transactions, the opportunity for so many permutations is huge. So this is why we've focused as an industry on trying to standardize our process flow as much as possible, but it's tough. It's tough to get the standardized process. It's also just tough to get your arms around the process and understand exactly how much of your process flow is standardized. So knowing what your actual process flow is actually one thing, kind of getting your arms around it, knowing your as-is situation is one thing. It's hard to do. It's hard to get that kind of capture. And then understanding why your flow, which you're wanting to be standardized, isn't being followed. I mean, that's another huge thing. If you could have that visibility over why your process wasn't actually as standardized as you wanted to be, and you had visibility not only on the size of the problem, but also where that problem was coming from, who were the key kind of culprits, or what were the key issues for that process not being standardized. I mean, this is vast. What we're going to be looking at today is the Vodafone story around how they implemented the Celonis tool that helped give Vodafone visibility. First of all, visualized each and every one of their transactions so that if Vodafone really wanted to, they could drill down to a transaction level and they could see the ones that didn't necessarily follow the preferred flow and the ones that did. And then knowing about the size of the ones that didn't follow the preferred flow and knowing what caused that deviation away from the preferred flow allowed Vodafone to set up particular projects to address those issues, and that then became part of their continuous improvement strategy. So a highly excellent, productive, high-performing tool to be examining today. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our guest speaker. So over please to Anthony Dayton.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susie. I really appreciate it. What I was going to share with you today is a bit about the story about Vodafone's P2P digital transformation journey and how they've been leveraging Celonis as part of that journey. In order to do that, I'm going to cover a couple of key and important ideas. First, I'll start with a bit of an overview about Celonis, about digital transformation, how we see the software industry changing. Then I'm going to transition and talk in some detail about what Vodafone has done using Celonis, and in particular in their P2P digital transformation. And then I'll actually show you a live demonstration of the Celonis software in the context of the P2P business process. In terms of a kind of start and understanding who Celonis is and what our Intelligent Business Cloud does, let me start with a bit of a top-level view. In our view, the software industry is shifting and our customers are coming to us with new and important business challenges for changing and transforming their businesses. Those come from two important trends in the market. The first is changing customer expectations, and the second is changes in how we get and create productivity in our businesses. From a customer perspective, we are all individual consumers. We all have experiences with online services like Netflix or buying things on Amazon, and that's creating a set of expectations about having a kind of instant on, high quality, authentic experience when we buy things on a personal level. And those personal expectations are translating into our work experiences. So when we think about how our vendor relationships and how we do business with our vendors, and also how we want to do business with our customers, the expectations about those relationships are increasing. At the same time, from a productivity perspective, the sort of trick that most businesses have used for driving productivity, which is to outsource work to low-cost labor markets, is simply not working anymore. And labor rates are equalizing, population growth is slowing, and so we can't use the sort of old tricks we had for driving productivity. So at a high level, what we need to do is figure out how we can do more, create better customer experiences, create better vendor relationships, and yet do that with less, with better productivity. And so that's creating what we call the transformation imperative, which is that every business and everyone on this call needs to find ways not to simply incrementally run their business a bit better, but actually to transform the way you do business to create that kind of next generation of business, next generation of relationships with your suppliers, next generation of customer experience in order to stay relevant for the long term. And yet change is incredibly difficult. The number one point I hear when I talk to customers is it's really difficult to change the way your business, your organization works. And why is change so hard? The change is hard because we've organized our businesses into a series of silos. So we have a manufacturing department and an accounting department and a sales organization and a logistics team. And each of these organizations are themselves a standalone entity. And as if to make matters more challenging, we've created systems to support each of these silos. So we have a manufacturing planning system and an accounting package and a CRM package, et cetera. So we created these systems which actually support these individual silos we've created in our organization. And then over the last 5, 10, 15 years, organizations have put in place dashboards, right? So what the BI vendors will tell you is there isn't a problem that can't be solved by yet another dashboard. And I would say I think we're sort of reaching the limits of what we can achieve by simply measuring another KPI on top of one of these siloed organizations. So the promise of Celonis and the idea of business transformation software is not to think about our businesses as a series of silos, but to actually think about the business from the outside in. So rather than thinking about how we're organized out, let's think about our business from the perspective that our customer has when they interact with us. And that is to say, think about it from a business process perspective. So think from an end-to-end perspective on how all of our organizations, our departments, our silos essentially can work together to create a great, efficient, high-value customer experience. A simple example of this I'll share. A customer of ours is in the distribution business. And one of the key issues in the distribution business is how quickly you can get things out of your inventory, out of your warehouse. So they looked at their warehouse. They actually spent millions of dollars and a little over a year actually automating a lot of their warehouse, putting in place tools, systems, technology to create a great warehouse. And they were able to move the amount of time it took to find something in their warehouse from hours to minutes. So instead of half a day, it could take a few minutes to get something, pick something out of their inventory. When they looked at the process from an end-to-end perspective, what they found is they actually wasted days on doing a credit check for a new customer. So think about it, a credit check is an accounting process, right? It's not core to the distribution business, but it was much lower hanging fruit to creating that great end-to-end experience. So the promise of Celonis is to think about how we can view our business as our customer views it, not as we're organized internally. And so when you think about your business that way, and you can do this across a range of different business processes. So on this call, we're talking a lot about procure to pay, and we'll come back to that in some detail in a moment. But you can think about things from an order to cash perspective and look at how Siemens has been able to save millions of dollars annually, or the customer journey experience of how you onboard customers, or how IT is delivered an organization such as Schlumberger, which is consolidating ERP systems. And we'll skip over Vodafone, of course, but also look at supply chain and how we can think about on-time delivery and cost savings in your supply chain at ABB. So there's high value in looking at your business from this perspective. So we've created a system we call the Intelligent Business Cloud, the Celonis Intelligent Business Cloud. So what is that? And then we'll talk about how Vodafone has used it. So the Celonis Intelligent Business Cloud is based on a technology we call process mining technology. And the way process mining technology works is that every one of us on this call has a range of systems that you're using to run your business. You may run on SAP or Microsoft Dynamics. You may have Oracle ERP. You may use ServiceNow for your ITSM or customer service perspective. So we have a range of operational systems that we use to run our business. as users interact with those operational systems, they leave behind what we call digital footprints. So they change data in that system. What process mining technology does is it watches how data changes in an underlying system. And based on how the data changes, or I like to say how the data flows through that system, we recreate the business process that created the data as we see it in that system. So we use the flow of data through operational systems to understand the business process in your organization. On top of this process mining technology, we've built our Intelligent Business Cloud, and it's comprised of a number of important capabilities. The first is event collection, which is the ability to connect to an operational system, find and understand the data in that system, and then generate what we call an event log, which is how we then understand and create the underlying process. And so creating and recreating that process is what we call process discovery. So there we actually take what we call an event log and we create and display, visualize the business process that generated that event log. We then marry that with a powerful analytical capability to create what we call process analytics. So now you can actually calculate business metrics on top of that business process. So you can look at things like what are the throughput rates, or what are the error rates or rework rates based on that process. Then we actually take the output, the insights generated from those analytical processes, and we use AI technology to then surface those as recommendations to people that work in that business process through what we call the action engine. The action engine is an AI system which actually gives recommendations to workers, to employees in a business process on changes they can make in their actions that will actually improve that business process. We package all four of these capabilities together in what we call the Intelligent Business App Store, which actually packages packaged solutions to important business challenges. For example, you might have something around rework in your P2P process, or removing blocks in orders for order to cash process, or improving customer experience in the customer service process. We package those as apps in the Intelligent Business App Store. And so taken together, this is what we call the Intelligent Business Cloud. So with that introduction to Celonis and sort of generally what the Intelligent Business Cloud is and does, let me shift gears a little bit and talk about Vodafone. Susie indicated this is a story about the purchase-to-pay process and how Vodafone has used process mining technology and the Celonis Intelligent Business Cloud to transform their P2P process. So just to start, a little context for who is, obviously I think everyone on the call is quite familiar with Vodafone, but just a little context. Vodafone is a massive business, a global business, operating in 25 countries from a mobile perspective, 18 from a fixed phone perspective. And they deal with a tremendous volume of data and a lot of revenue. And so the reason I bring this up is it's important to understand from a context perspective that Vodafone is a complex organization with many different business processes. Also, importantly, just from a history perspective, a lot of Vodafone had grown through acquisition. So if you go back in history, 10, 15 years, Vodafone was largely a UK-based provider, and through acquisition, it sort of built up a global business operating in many countries. And of course, as I'm sure everyone or many of you on this call may have experienced, when you have a business that's grown through acquisition like that, you end up with many different systems and many different inconsistent processes and inconsistent metrics. And so in the finance organization, Vodafone was challenged with how they could create consistency across those processes, across those systems from an ERP perspective, et cetera. A couple of important points. They had shared services centers globally. So they had actually created centers of excellence. It's a large team, over 20,000 people. And this was a long-running effort to actually consolidate a lot of the efforts that they had going out over 10 years. And then this is a really important point. Even though they had grown through acquisition, they had many different underlying ERP systems. They had an effort to consolidate all of the ERPs into a common and shared SAP system. And so as I'm sure anyone who's worked on a project like that knows, just consolidating the system isn't enough. It's also important to create consistency from a business process perspective. And so they needed to create a shared business process across the entire organization as if they were going to consolidate into a common ERP system. So a lot of the challenges that Vodafone struggled with are things that I think everyone in this call may be familiar with. So they wanted to have a single, consistent process that had worked across ERP systems and then actually brought those together into a single SAP system. And yet they had a series of local markets with different needs and requirements. And they wanted to be able to do that at scale and report globally for that. So they created a program they called the EVO program. And it had 4 critical elements to it. The first is they created a core, what they call the core business model. So they actually defined the important business practices that they were going to implement globally. In this particular case, for the finance organization, they were focused in the Hungary and India shared services centers. They had moved to a single ERP system, so in this case, SAP, and they created a global procurement organization called the Vodafone Procurement Company. As part of this EVO program, they were looking to standardize processes across their different markets. So they wanted to create a single instance, what they called a global process owner, around each of the major processes that they controlled in their shared services finance organization. And so they would have global process owners that would work through and work with each of the folks in their local markets to help create this globally consistent process. If you look at how an organization might have approached this problem in the past, how would you create a globally consistent process and understand whether or not it was actually being used around the world? The old style way of doing this would have been typically what you see on this slide. You would start with process modeling. Most projects like this actually start with a whiteboard where you sit people down and you give them a marker and you say, draw for me your desired process. And people will react to draw the process as they wish it would be, or the process as they've experienced it. So maybe it's specific to a local market, et cetera. Or they might, express some particular variation in the process that they're particularly annoyed with or that they've experienced recently. But this is a very typical way of starting a project like this, which is creating this sort of top-down, from my gut type process model. At the same time, they will often use a consultative approach. So if you want to see what the process really is, then you go visit a shared service center. You go sit with the team in Hungary and actually watch them as they process invoices, as they look at POs. And you can actually literally see whether or not they're complying with the process or what process they're actually using. And then Susie had indicated this in the introduction. In many cases, they use KPIs. So the feeling is if we can define a set of KPIs and we monitor those, then somehow we will create consistency from a process perspective. One of the challenges, of course, is that often these KPIs are lagging. So you're looking at how you've done past tense, not how you will do or how you're doing currently. And one of the biggest challenges that Vodafone articulates in this old way of transforming, in this case, the purchase-to-pay process, is it wasn't a data-driven process. Nothing in whiteboard process modeling or consulting or KPIs is a data-driven process because you're typically dealing with the sort of verbal feedback from the teams that you work with. And the way they said this, which I thought was very insightful, is the people that get the attention when you work this way are the ones who shout the loudest. So literally, it's just a question of reacting to the organization as opposed to driving the process and actually creating consistency across that process. Vodafone started their work with Celonis around this process in early 2015, and they actually did start in the finance organization, although the work at Vodafone has extended beyond that. It wasn't an enormous team, so implemented by a team of 3. And what's important here is that as part of the EVO process, they defined these global process leads who were responsible from a business perspective to create both what a globally consistent process would be and then ensure compliance with it. They teamed that sort of business perspective with what we call data scientists or people who can understand the data and use the Celonis tool, and that's the important part, to then create the data behind how we're going to create consistency around that process. So it moved it from being a kind of emotional conversation around who can yell the loudest to a data-driven conversation. And I think it's important to recognize that the process was iterative. So, this wasn't a sort of one and done process, but You simply have to keep going back against the process, look at the data, understand compliance, and businesses change. The processes change, requirements change, the flow of information changes, and so you need to sort of stay on top of it. And I think Vodafone has done a good job of taking what was a good core idea and training up other teams, looking at it across other processes within the finance organization. We'll come to that actually in a second. The work at Vodafone began in a place where the most advanced is in the accounts payable area, and that's a little bit of where you'll see some of the focus on the next set of slides. But there are other areas in the shared services finance organization in which they are using and beginning to use process mining technology in Celonis. So thinking about things like cash management and as a working capital is an important area. APA for them is asset purchases, so large purchases, especially in a telecom environment. They're putting up towers, they're buying large assets. So IT purchases, T&E is fairly obvious. And then in ICO, which stands for intercompany operations, as they move cash and other assets between sub-entities, that was another important area where they're beginning the use of process mining. And they also think about this as a journey. So they don't start with everything, but they have, this is their slide, but what they think about is a kind of journey for how they create consistency in their process. So they start with visualizing the process, actually understanding what the as-is process, looking at root cause, understanding what the next best action they could take to improve that. Think about scenario modeling so they can actually support the business with making good business decisions about how to improve the process. Conformance for understanding whether they're complying with that process and actually understanding where deviation occurs. And then in the future, looking to apply machine learning technology to actually make proactive recommendations about what should happen, sort of future tense in that process, and looking at things like how they can support employees in improving their day-to-day work and actually improve the throughput or compliance on the metrics around that process. So just drilling into each of those steps in a little bit more detail, and then I will actually show it to you and make it very live. The screenshots you see here are actual screenshots of Vodafone's use of the Celonis. So starting with process discovery, what the process discovery capability allows you to do is actually literally see the process, so understand what order steps occur, what steps are connected to which steps, also look at things like throughput time, bottlenecks, rework, and actually see that visually so you can actually explore that process and understand where it breaks down or where it's really efficient. We combine that with what they call root cause analysis, which is the ability to use analytical systems to understand what's the business value to improving that process, or what they call the next best action. What's the next best thing you could do to make this process more efficient, better? In fact, if you look at this screenshot here, what you're looking at is what they call the perfect invoice. So a perfect invoice is an invoice that comes into the system, is able to be put into the system, processed, paid without any human being interacting with it at all. And there are a couple of important elements to, in their case, a perfect invoice. It needs to be received on time. It needs to be received electronically. It needs to have payment terms which are acceptable. And if all of those things are true, then it can become a perfect invoice. You can move through the system perfectly. In Vodafone's case, they were able to move touchless invoices from 13% to 45% of all of their invoices, which saved them over 30 full-time equivalents in the 2-year process that they had been looking at that in. So that's a fairly substantial improvement in the touchless invoices and the significant business value to improving it. On the scenario modeling side, they're able to empower the business with a what-if capability to understand how changes in their business practices would affect the purchase-to-pay process generally, and in particular, the working capital, the effect on working capital. So a good example of this is PO versus non-PO purchases. A purchase which is got backed by a purchase order, there's specific payment terms and other terms. If you can benchmark the payment terms we're getting, as an example, the payment terms we're getting on PO-backed purchases versus non-PO purchases, then you can show the business literally, if we could move all purchases that are not on POs onto the same payment terms that we get for PO purchases, what the change, what the effect on working capital would be. And so now you can actually understand the effect or the value that changes in payment terms can be had. And in many cases, the business is simply unaware that variation in payment terms could have such a big improvement or big impact on something as important as working capital. It also gives them an opportunity to do things like rationalize the payment terms. So being able to understand how many different payment terms does an organization like this have. You can see, they clearly had quite a few. And then be able to understand, why do we have so many different payment terms, and what would the value be? What's a what-if analysis that would show us the value of actually standardizing or consolidating those payment terms? Conformance is the next major area where they've been working with us. And what's important about conformance is that it allows us to create a linkage between this whiteboard process of drawing out what we think the process should be with the data-driven process of understanding how well we comply to that. So in this case, we replaced the whiteboard with a DPML model of the actual underlying process. And we can take that modeled process, and then we can actually run every single transaction against that model. So what Vodafone is able to do is say, here's our globally standardized process, and here's the millions of transactions, the millions of purchases that we actually make. What % of them actually comply with that process? And you can actually see that on this next screen. So here, having modeled the underlying purchasing process, they're able to take all of the different transactions and understand what % of those cases, what % of those purchases actually conform with the process. But not only can they understand true, false, yes, we conform, no, we don't, but it actually gives details on the effect that conformance has on the throughput of that process. So for example, being able to understand things like, if we conform with the process, here's the result of that in terms of throughput, in terms of working capital, et cetera. And when we don't conform, what is the cause of that violation? Do we do steps out of order? Do we do these sorts of things? So it really focuses the conversation around the data, and it moves it away from feelings, I feel this is true, to facts. A quick summary just from a Vodafone perspective, what they've been able to do in their purchase to pay process, focusing on that next best action, guiding the business to know what they should do next to improve that process, really being able to increase the capability of their purchasing and finance organization generally. And I think it's really important to focus on this idea of transforming from a people perspective, because ultimately any business process is about the people who are involved in that process, helping people understand the impact that their day-to-day decisions make on something like working capital, which maybe feel a little esoteric until you actually see it in a very practical and upfront sense. And they've gotten significant value out of this. So being able to drive touchless invoices up, save a lot in terms of time and money, but also really being able to bring and make data-driven decisions as opposed to emotional or I feel type decisions. Maybe I can shift gears a little bit, and I'll just show you a little bit of what I was talking about theoretically there for a moment. What you're looking at here, and hopefully this shows through nicely, is the Celonis Intelligent Business Cloud, and I'm showing you data about a purchasing process. So what you're looking at is what we talked about earlier around process discovery, being able to see and visualize and understand that business process. So here in this demo data set, we're looking at a little over 1 million purchase order items. And what you can see down the center here is the purchase to pay process out of those 1.2 million purchase orders. So the process starts by creating a purchase requisition item, then we create a purchase order item, then we actually send the purchase order to the vendor, we get the goods, we record the goods, and then we pay the invoice. Now, of course, everyone on the call should go, well, of course, that's pretty obvious. That's what the purchasing process should be. That's probably what you would have written down on that whiteboard. But what's important is in the lower right corner here, we can see that this purchasing process only covers a little under 40% of the 1.2 million transactions in this data set. So to be very precise, it's 420,584 of those purchase items go through this process. So the question is, what other processes do they go through? And you can see that aligned right here. So the next most common process is that we don't start by creating a purchase requisition item. So we start by creating the purchase order, right? So that we may be buying things that people don't actually want. Let's look at the next most common variant. So the next most common variant is after having sent the purchase order, we have to change the price based on some business requirement prior to receiving the goods. So it's a classic example of rework, Let's look at this in a little more detail for a second. So here we have a case, send the purchase order. After having sent the purchase order, we now make a change in the payment terms, or the price in this case. And you can see the impact that this has from a process perspective, because when we send the purchase order and then receive the goods, that takes 8 days. When we make a change in the price, it takes 17 days, so significantly longer from so how we deliver value back to the business. And if you look at automation rates, you can start to see why. Because changing the price, only 18% automated, meaning it's mostly a manual process, even though sending the purchase order and even receiving the goods is reasonably well automated in this data set. So you can start to see why some of these things are true. And you can keep going like this. So you can keep adding variants. Now we're covering about 71% of the cases. I mean, this is a very classic case here where we receive the invoice and then go back and create the purchase order, having realized that we bought something. Clearly, not a process that we would want. So you start to see the value of process discovery and understanding that business process and starting to tease it apart. Now we can actually look at what Vodafone was talking about around conformance. So here you can actually see the defined process in this for this demo company for how we would like the purchasing process to work. And this is something you can do right within Celonis, or you could use your favorite modeling tool. And what we do from a data perspective is we take that model and we hold it up against all 1.12 million purchase orders that came through the system to ask the question, did we comply with that process? And you can see in this case, we've complied about 56%. You can see how that occurs over time. And importantly, you can see why we didn't conform. So for example, change price is something we want to avoid, is the #1 reason why we don't comply with the process. You can also see other examples like recording the invoice receipt as the first step. That was that case I showed you where we actually received the item before having created the purchase order. That's clearly a violation of the process. You can take any one of these examples and look at it analytically. So for example, when we change the price, you can see that the throughput time is significantly worse. There are more steps because it's more rework. It's lower automation rate, 18 versus 50%. And we can use AI techniques to actually go back through that data and ask the question, where is it in the purchasing process that we're actually creating these change of price? And you can see, for example, it could be a particular vendor in a particular location, in this case, Chicago, particular material groups, et cetera. So we're using that AI capability to go back through the data and really do what an analyst might do, which is sort of hunt and peck to figure out where that violation occurs. Now, this is really powerful from an analytical perspective, but it doesn't actually change behavior. And that's where the action engine comes in. So what the action engine does, and let's look at this from a procurement perspective, it takes those analytical models, it takes that conformance capability, and it actually runs it in the background. And it looks at all the data, not the data that's happened historically, but the new data that's coming in. And when a new purchase order comes in, it holds that purchase order up against the model and asks the question, what could we do with this purchase order to improve the process? And so you can see here, I mean, there's a bunch of really good examples, like we might see a major price increase. So we've got a new purchase order in, and the vendor is giving us back a significantly higher price than we've had historically, and that needs intervention from a purchasing perspective. So, and now we can actually drop you straight into, for example, in this case, it's that SAP system, to either revert back that change from a price perspective or accept the change from a pricing perspective and move that purchase order along. Or other examples, like we might be tracking an automation rate. So we have a vendor which historically has been sending invoices in through that perfect purchasing process where the invoice comes in electronically and we're able to process it. And yet, in the last 30 days, the automation rate has decreased significantly. It's gone down 23%. And maybe something's changed in the supplier systems or in our systems or in what we're buying from them, which causes us to ask the question, how can we go back and improve that automation rate from that particular supplier? Or even master data. So we might have, for example, a particular item that we're purchasing, in this case it's a light bulb, and we're seeing a significant number of price changes, and that suggests that the underlying master data is actually incorrect. And so it would be better to go back and actually look at what prices we have in the master data system, so we don't have to keep reverting back and changing that price to have it match the master data. And the important point to get here is this is not an analytical view. This is an action view. This is taking that analytical insight and making it actionable from a user perspective, so we can actually improve and change that process. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Susie, to take control.
Great. Thank you very much, Anthony. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.